Hey there, chess fans. Welcome back to the channel where we break down games move by move to help you sharpen your skills and understand the beautiful game a little better. Today, we're diving into a fascinating battle between OngoleBull and opponent, featuring an unknown opening that leads to some instructive moments right from the start. So, buckle up and let's jump straight into the opening phase. White kicks things off with e4, staking a claim in the center and opening lines for the bishop and queen. This is textbook opening strategy: control the center and get your pieces ready to develop. Black replies with c6, signaling the Caro-Kann defense, a solid and resilient choice that supports d5 and aims for a strong pawn structure. White develops the knight to f3, attacking the center and preparing to castle kingside. Black strikes in the center with d5, challenging White's e4 pawn and fighting for central space. This is the key idea behind the Caro-Kann: a solid pawn chain and flexible piece development. White captures on d5, exchanging pawns and opening the position slightly. This move gains a small material edge but also opens lines for Black's pieces. Black recaptures with c takes d5, maintaining a strong pawn presence in the center. White pushes d4, reinforcing control over the center and opening lines for the dark squared bishop. This move is consistent with classical opening principles. Black develops the knight to c6, putting pressure on d4 and preparing to castle. White brings out the knight to c3, supporting the d4 pawn and contesting the center. Black develops the knight to f6, attacking e4 and preparing kingside safety. White plays bishop b5, pinning the knight on c6 and increasing pressure on Black's center. This is a flexible move that can lead to doubled pawns for Black if White decides to exchange. Black responds with bishop d7, breaking the pin and preparing to recapture if White exchanges. This is a natural developing move, keeping the position solid. White castles kingside, ensuring king safety and connecting the rooks. This is a critical step in completing development. Black plays a6, challenging the bishop on b5 and asking White to decide whether to exchange or retreat. White captures on c6, bishop takes c6, exchanging the bishop for the knight. This decision doubles Black's pawns but also gives Black the bishop pair. Black recaptures with b takes c6. Here, the evaluation jumps to a clear advantage for Black, about 1.14 pawns. Why? Because this move opens the b-file for Black's rook and strengthens control over the center. However, the engine suggests that Black could have improved with bishop takes c6 instead, keeping a more flexible pawn structure and maintaining better piece activity. This teaches us that sometimes recapturing with a pawn can create structural weaknesses or strengths depending on the position. White develops the bishop to g5, pinning Black's knight on f6. This is a natural developing move, but the engine notes that knight e5 would have been stronger here, aiming to centralize the knight and increase pressure on Black's position. Black challenges the bishop with h6, asking White to decide whether to exchange or retreat. This is a common thematic move to question pins and force a decision. White retreats the bishop to h4, maintaining the pin and keeping tension. This is a patient move, preserving pressure on Black's knight. Black plays e6, solidifying the center and opening lines for the dark squared bishop. However, this move allows White to maintain a slight edge. The engine suggests bishop g4 would have been better here, developing the bishop actively and pinning White's knight, which could have complicated White's plans. This position teaches us that timely piece activity often trumps passive pawn moves. White centralizes the knight with knight e5, increasing pressure on Black's position and eyeing key squares. This move aligns with the earlier suggestion and is a strong strategic choice. Black develops the bishop to e7, preparing to castle and breaking the pin on the knight. White captures the bishop on d7 with knight takes d7, exchanging a knight for a bishop and slightly shifting the imbalance in material. The engine notes that knight a4 would have been a better move here, aiming to control key squares and keep more tension in the position. Black recaptures with knight takes d7, maintaining material balance and completing development. Bishop takes e7. Here White captures the bishop on e7, trading off a key defender of Black's king and slightly simplifying the position. This is a natural move, but notice the evaluation barely shifts, indicating the position remains roughly balanced. The key idea here is that white is removing a potentially active piece from black camp, which can help in easing pressure later on. Queen takes e7, black recaptures with the queen, keeping material even and maintaining central control. This is the most straightforward response, as ignoring the capture would lose material. The queen now occupies a central square, which can be both a strength and a target depending on how the game unfolds. Rook e1. White places the rook on the open e-file. A classic strategic principle. Rooks belong on open or semi-open files to maximize their activity. This move also indirectly eyes the e6 pawn, which could become a target in the future. Short castling, black castles kingside, prioritizing king safety. This is a standard and necessary step in development. Castling also connects the rooks, preparing for future central or kingside play. h3. White plays a useful prophylactic move, preventing black's pieces, especially the knight or bishop, from jumping into g4. This is a subtle but important idea, controlling key squares around your king to avoid annoying pins or attacks. Rook a b8. Black brings the rook to the semi-open b-file, aiming to put pressure on white's queenside pawns and possibly prepare for pawn breaks or piece infiltration. This is a thematic move in positions where the b-file is open or semi-open. Rook b1. White mirrors black's rook move, contesting the b-file and preventing black from gaining easy access. This is a good example of active defense. Sometimes the best defense is to challenge your opponent's plans head-on. c5. Black strikes in the center and queenside with the pawn push c5. This move aims to challenge white's central d4 pawn and open lines for black's pieces. It's a critical strategic decision to gain space and create tension. Knight takes d5. White captures the pawn on d5 with the knight, taking advantage of the tension in the center. This move helps white gain material and opens lines for the pieces. The knight on d5 is very well placed, central and active. Queen d6. Black centralizes the queen, attacking the knight on d5 and maintaining pressure on the center. This move also eyes the h2 pawn, hinting at potential kingside threats. Knight c3. White retreats the knight back to c3, reinforcing control over the center and preparing to support the d4 pawn. This is a cautious but solid choice, avoiding exchanges that might favor black. C takes d4. Black captures on d4, opening the c-file and trying to break white's central control. This move increases tension and forces white to make decisions about the pawn structure. Knight e2. White repositions the knight to e2, a flexible square from which it can support the center or jump to more active posts like g3 or f4. This move also prepares to recapture on d4 if needed. e5. Black pushes the pawn to e5, gaining space and challenging white's center. This is a thematic break in many pawn structures, aiming to open lines for black's pieces and create attacking chances. f4. White responds aggressively by pushing f4, contesting the e5 pawn and trying to clamp down on black's central expansion. This move shows white's intent to fight for space and initiative. f6. Black supports the e5 pawn with f6, solidifying the center and preventing white's pawn from advancing to e5. This move also restricts white's knight and bishop somewhat. Rook f1. White doubles down on the f-file pressure by moving the rook to f1, eyeing black's kingside and preparing for potential attacks. This is a good example of coordinating rooks on open files to increase pressure. Queen c5. Black shifts the queen to c5, targeting the c3 knight and putting pressure on white's queenside. This move also keeps an eye on the long diagonal and maintains flexibility. King h1. White steps the king off the g1 square, a common prophylactic move to avoid potential checks or pins along the g-file or diagonals. This subtle king safety measure can be crucial in sharp middle games. Knight b6. Black develops the knight to b6, attacking the queen's side and supporting the c4 square. This move also prepares to reroute the knight to more active squares, increasing black's piece activity. F takes e5. White captures on e5, opening the f-file and attempting to break black's pawn chain. However, this move is a missed opportunity. The engine suggests that c3 would have been stronger here, reinforcing the center and keeping tension. By taking on e5, White allows black to recapture and maintain a solid pawn structure, reducing white's attacking chances. F takes e5. Black recaptures on e5, maintaining central control and opening lines for the rook and queen. This is the natural response, keeping the position balanced. Rook takes f8 check. White sacrifices the rook on f8 with check, forcing black to respond. This is a powerful tactical shot, exploiting the pin on the f-file and aiming to weaken black's king safety. The evaluation shows a significant swing here, indicating white gains a material advantage through this exchange. Rook takes f8. Black captures back with the rook, forced to maintain material balance and avoid losing the queen or king safety. This move ends the immediate tactical sequence but leaves black slightly worse due to the weakened pawn structure and exposed king. Queen d3. White brings the queen to d3, aiming to centralize and perhaps prepare to challenge black's queen or support a pawn push. However, this move is a missed opportunity. The engine suggests c3 would have been stronger here, reinforcing the center and limiting black's pawn breaks. The key idea is that by playing c3, white would have prevented black's d4 pawn from advancing freely, maintaining better control over the critical central squares. Queen c4. Black shifts the queen to c4, putting pressure on white's queenside and eyeing potential infiltration points. This move is solid but not the best. The better alternative was queen c6, which would have kept more control over the long diagonal and supported the d4 pawn more effectively. This subtle difference shows how queen placement can influence both defense and attack simultaneously. Queen takes c4 check. White captures black's queen with check, a natural and strong move that simplifies the position and gains material. However, the engine notes that queen e4 would have been even better, maintaining pressure and keeping options open to attack black's weaknesses rather than exchanging queens immediately. This teaches us that sometimes keeping tension on the board can be more valuable than simplifying, especially when you have attacking chances. Knight takes c4. Black recaptures with the knight, maintaining material balance but now facing a more vulnerable position. The knight on c4 is active but also a potential target for white's pawns and pieces. b3. White challenges the knight on c4, forcing it to decide its future. However, this move is a missed opportunity. The engine suggests king g1 would have been better, improving king safety and preparing to bring the rook into play without weakening the queenside structure. The key lesson here is that pawn moves near your king can create weaknesses, so improving piece coordination and king safety often takes priority. Knight e3. Black's knight jumps to e3, an aggressive and active post, attacking white's rook and pawns. This move increases black's activity and puts pressure on white's position. c4. White pushes the pawn to c4, trying to challenge black's knight and gain space on the queenside. This is a logical attempt to dislodge the active knight, but it also creates some weaknesses on d3 and b3 squares. Rook f2. Black brings the rook to f2, doubling down on pressure along the second rank and preparing to invade white's position. This move is thematic. Rooks on the second rank can be very dangerous, threatening pawns and cutting off king escape routes. Rook e1. White responds by placing the rook on e1, contesting the e-file and supporting the center. This is a natural developing move, but it doesn't fully solve the problem of black's active pieces. d3. Black pushes the pawn to d3, creating a passed pawn and cramping white's position. This is a critical strategic thrust, forcing white to react and opening lines for black's pieces. The key idea here is that passed pawns in the middle game can be a huge asset, especially when supported by pieces. Knight c3. White develops the knight to c3, aiming to block the passed pawn and control key squares. This is a good defensive move, but white still faces pressure. d2. Black pushes the pawn to d2, one step away from promotion. This move is a tactical turning point. Interestingly, the engine suggests rook c2 would have been better here, attacking white's rook and supporting the pawn's promotion threat more effectively. This shows how coordinating pieces to support passed pawns is crucial. Rook takes e3. White captures the knight on e3 with the rook, removing a key attacker and gaining material. This is a strong move, shifting the evaluation back in white's favor. The key idea is that eliminating active enemy pieces near your king can reduce pressure and improve your chances. Rook f1 check. Black checks with the rook on f1, forcing white's king to move. This is a natural attempt to keep the initiative and create counterplay. King h2. White steps the king to h2, escaping the check and avoiding pins or forks. This is a safe and practical choice, improving king safety. d1 equals q. Black promotes the pawn to a queen, gaining a powerful new piece. However, this move is a missed opportunity. The engine suggests rook c1 would have been better, attacking white's rook and maintaining pressure without allowing white to capture the queen easily. This teaches us that sometimes promoting immediately isn't the best if the promoted piece can be quickly neutralized. Knight takes d1. White captures the newly promoted queen with the knight, removing black's biggest threat and gaining material advantage. This is a critical moment where white regains control. Rook takes d1. Black recaptures with the rook, keeping material balance but now facing a worse position due to white's extra pawns and better piece coordination. Rook takes e5. White captures the pawn on e5 with the rook, increasing material advantage and simplifying into a winning endgame. This move also opens lines for white's rook to invade black's position further. Rook a1. Black moves the rook to a1, trying to create counterplay on the a file. However, this is a missed opportunity. The engine suggests king f7 would have been better, improving king safety and preparing to support the rook's activity. This shows how king activity is crucial in the endgame phase. Rook a5. White brings the rook to a5, putting pressure on black's pawns and controlling key squares. This is a strong, active move that increases white's winning chances. Rook b1. Black shifts the rook to b1, aiming to challenge white's control on the queenside and create threats against white's pawns. Rook takes a6. White captures the pawn on a6, further increasing material advantage and simplifying into a winning position. This move also removes black's last pawn on the queenside, making black's defense even harder. Rook b2. Black moves the rook to b2, trying to stay active and create counterplay, but the position is already lost due to white's material and positional superiority. c5. White pushes the pawn to c5, and this is a powerful strategic thrust. Notice how white is leveraging the extra pawns to gain space and restrict black's rook and king. The key idea here is to create passed pawns or at least force black into passive defense. White's 3 extra pawns are like a ticking time bomb, and this move starts to activate that advantage. Rook c2. Black moves the rook to c2, trying to challenge white's control on the second rank. But here, black misses a critical defensive resource. The engine suggests king f7 would have been better, aiming to centralize the king and support the defense against white's advancing pawns. Instead, rook c2 allows white to keep the initiative and maintain pressure. This teaches us that in rook endgames, king activity is often more important than rook maneuvers alone. b4. White pushes b4, solidifying the pawn chain and preparing to push further on the queenside. This move is consistent with white's plan of creating unstoppable passed pawns. Notice how white is methodically improving the position without rushing, a great example of patient, strategic play. Rook c4. Black's rook moves to c4, trying to stay active and challenge white's pawns. This is a natural attempt to create counterplay, but it's too little, too late. White's pawns are too far advanced, and black's king remains passive. a3. White pushes a3, supporting the b4 pawn and preparing to push b5 next. This move also restricts black's rook from invading on the b-file. White's plan is crystal clear. Create a strong pawn chain and push black's king into a defensive shell. King f7. Black finally activates the king, moving it towards the center. This is a good practical move, trying to get closer to the pawns and help in defense. However, it's a bit late. White's pawns are already too advanced, and black's rook is tied down. The key takeaway here is that king activity is crucial in endgames, and delays can be costly. c6. White pushes c6, a very strong move, creating a passed pawn that is only a few steps from promotion. This move forces black into a defensive posture and highlights the power of connected passed pawns in the endgame. King e7. Black moves the king closer to the pawns, trying to stop the c-pawn's advance. This is logical, but white's position is still dominant. The lesson here is that even active king moves can't compensate for the material and positional disadvantage when facing multiple passed pawns. Rook a7 check. White checks with the rook, forcing black's king to move again. This is a nice tactical touch, using the rook to keep black's king restricted and unable to support the defense effectively. King d8, black moves the king to d8, but this is a missed opportunity. The engine suggests king d6 would have been better, aiming to stay closer to the pawns and contest white's advance more aggressively. Instead, king d8 allows white to continue pushing with less resistance. This teaches us the importance of king positioning in pawn endgames. The king should always strive to be in front of or close to the passed pawns. b5, white pushes b5, continuing the pawn storm. This move further restricts black's rook and king, and it's clear white is marching towards promotion. The key idea here is that advancing connected passed pawns together can overwhelm even active pieces. Rook c5, black's rook moves to c5, trying to block the b-pawn's advance. This is a natural defensive attempt, but white's pawns are too strong and coordinated. a4, white pushes a4, supporting the b5 pawn and preparing to push b6 next. This move tightens the noose around black's king and rook, limiting their mobility. King c8, black moves the king to c8, trying to stay close to the pawns. However, this is another missed opportunity. The engine suggests g5 would have been better, aiming to create counterplay or distractions on the kingside. Instead, black remains passive, and white's pawns keep rolling forward. This position teaches us that sometimes when under pressure, creating counter-threats is essential to survive. Rook takes g7, white captures the pawn on g7 with the rook, increasing material advantage and opening lines. This is a strong move, but the engine notes that rook b7 would have been even stronger, aiming to cut off black's king and prepare for a quicker promotion. This highlights how sometimes improving piece placement can be more effective than immediate captures. Rook c4, black's rook moves to c4, trying to stay active. But this move is a missed chance. The engine suggests king b8 would have been better, bringing the king closer to the queenside pawns and preparing to block white's advance more effectively. This shows the importance of king activity over rook maneuvers in such endgames. Rook a7, white brings the rook back to a7, maintaining pressure and controlling key squares. However, the engine points out that a5 would have been a stronger push, immediately threatening to break through black's defenses. This teaches us that sometimes pushing pawns aggressively can be more effective than shuffling pieces around. King b8, black moves the king to b8, trying to guard the promotion squares. This is a natural defensive move, but again, the engine suggests rook b4 would have been better, aiming to challenge white's rook and create counterplay. This highlights how passive defense often leads to defeat in rook and pawn endgames. Rook b7 check. White checks with the rook, forcing black's king to move again. This keeps black tied down and unable to organize effective resistance. King c8, black moves the king back to c8, but this is a missed chance. The engine suggests king a8 would have been better, staying on the edge and preparing to block white's pawns more stubbornly. This shows how precise king placement can make a big difference in endgames. a5, white pushes a5, advancing the pawn majority and threatening to create a passed pawn on the a-file. This move is crushing and leads directly to mate in 14. The key takeaway is that pushing past pawns with support from the rook and king is a winning formula in endgames. Rook a4, black's rook moves to a4, trying to stop the pawn. However, this is a missed opportunity. The engine suggests rook c5 would have been better, aiming to stay active and challenge white's rook. This teaches us that when facing passed pawns, active piece play is crucial to create counter threats. a6, white pushes a6, one step closer to promotion. This move tightens the noose and leaves black with very few options. Rook a5, black's rook moves to a5, trying to block the pawn's advance. But this is a missed chance. The engine suggests king d8 would have been better, bringing the king closer to help in defense. This final sequence shows how black's passive defense and missed opportunities allowed white to convert the advantage smoothly. a7, white pushes the pawn to a7, and this is absolutely crushing. The key idea here is that this pawn is now just one step away from promotion, and black's position is on the brink of collapse. Notice how white's material advantage and active rook combine to create unstoppable threats. This pawn is like a ticking time bomb, forcing black into a desperate situation. Rook takes a7, black captures the pawn with the rook, but this is a critical mistake. Why? Because by taking the pawn, black walks right into white's trap. The engine shows that instead of capturing, king d8 would have been a better defensive try, aiming to keep the king close to the promotion square and delay white's plans. Capturing here loses a full rook and accelerates the mate sequence. This teaches us that sometimes, grabbing material can be a fatal blunder if it opens the door to a forced mate or decisive attack. Rook takes a7, white immediately recaptures the rook, and now white's material advantage explodes. White is up a rook and multiple pawns, and the mating net is tightening fast. This move is straightforward but powerful. White's rook now dominates the a-file and supports the unstoppable pawn advance. King b8. Black tries to bring the king closer to the queenside pawns, but this is another missed opportunity. The engine suggests king d8 again would have been better, trying to stay central and block white's pawns more effectively. Instead, moving the king to b8 allows white to push forward with even less resistance. This position teaches us that in such endgames, king placement is critical. The king should always aim to block or capture past pawns, not run away. b6. White pushes the b-pawn forward, creating a direct threat of promotion. This is a textbook example of how to use connected passed pawns to crush your opponent. Notice how white's rook supports the pawn's advance, and black's king is forced into a passive role. The key takeaway here is that pushing past pawns with rook support is a winning strategy in rook endgames. King c8. Black moves the king back to c8, but this is yet another missed chance. The engine suggests h5 would have been better, trying to create some counterplay or at least distract white's rook. Instead, black's king shuffle does nothing to stop the inevitable mate. White has a forced mate in one move next, a clear sign that black's position is hopeless. Alright, friends, what can we learn from this final phase? First, passed pawns supported by active rooks and well-placed kings are incredibly powerful. They can force decisive breakthroughs even against active pieces. Second, king activity and precise placement are crucial in endgames. Passive or repetitive king moves can quickly lead to disaster. Third, be very cautious about capturing pawns or pieces if it opens up mating nets or decisive tactics. Sometimes, the best defense is to stay solid and block key squares. If you've enjoyed this detailed breakdown and want to improve your chess understanding, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We bring you deep insights like these every week to help you grow as a player. Don't miss out on future videos that can elevate your game. Thanks so much for sticking with me through this exciting endgame. Remember, the king is your best friend in the endgame, and mastering these concepts will take your play to the next level. If you found value in this video, please hit that subscribe button and join our community of passionate chess learners. Keep practicing those endgames, and if you want more content that breaks down complex positions into clear ideas, subscribing is the best way to stay updated. See you in the next video.